Hello everyone, in this video we're going to be doing a really deep dive on Geosesarma vampire crab care. But before we begin, you need to watch this video first because it will give you a quick overview of what to expect from vampire crabs as pets, because they might not be for you. We're going to be covering the following topics, all of which I've broken down into chapters so you can easily navigate through the video. I've also included individual detailed videos of this for just about every other topic, which are linked in the description. And if you want to support the channel and get even more in-depth information, you can grab a copy of our ebook as well, which is linked in the description. So Chapter 1, a brief introduction to Geosesarma. Vampire crabs, Geosesarma sp, are a small freshwater vampire crab native to the forests of Indonesia, Borneo, Malaysia, and other parts of Southeast Asia. They are generally low maintenance pets, but there are some really important things you need to know to keep them happy, healthy, and alive. I'll be referencing quite a few of my other videos in this guide, so make sure you check them out when they pop up because they're going to deep dive into those specific topics. Also, if you're looking at keeping Lepidothalfusa crabs, I have a full care guide for those as well, linked below, because they are quite a bit different to Geosesarma vampire crabs. So don't confuse the two species if you're deciding between which one to get. Chapter 2, Enclosure and Environmental Basics for Vampire Crabs. Vampire crabs are quite small with a maximum size of about 5 centimeters or around 2 inches, so they don't need a huge amount of space or a large enclosure to be kept in captivity. That said though, there are still quite a few important rules to follow to make sure your tank is set up perfectly, and a lot of that comes down to design. If you don't get this right, you'll have a complete bloodbath on your hands. So a 5-gallon tank is the minimum size recommended for a group of 3 vampire crabs, 1 male and 2 females. But any larger tank will provide more space for the crabs to explore and establish territories and reduce fighting. It's really important to provide plenty of hiding spots for the crabs as they are quite shy and prefer to have plenty of places to retreat to. So it's good to have a lot of cork bark, hollows, any sort of places like that, and a lot of live plants to create a natural and comfortable environment. The more natural you make it, the better, and the more active your crabs will generally be. Remember, they are a rainforest crab, so try to emulate the rainforest as much as possible. An interesting fact about Geosesarma species is that there's currently 4 known species that prefer to spend more time off the ground and up in the canopy, and these are the 4 arboreal species of vampire crab. So if you do plan on keeping one of these species, I highly suggest getting a vertical style tank and creating it specifically for these species. So they are Geosesarma nodiphorum, Geosesarma pontianak, Geosesarma orchid, and Geosesarma noduliferum. Vampire crabs also need a really warm, humid environment with a humidity level of about 75% or higher. And while you can use a humidifier to increase humidity, it's just as easy to make sure the tank is closed up quite well with a little bit of ventilation and then just spray it with a spray bottle. This is generally how I do it. It's a lot cheaper and a lot easier. And most importantly, you need to make sure you have a lid on your tank because vampire crabs are very good at escaping. They can even climb silicon and wet glass, so they will try to escape at every possible opportunity. So, water section rules and water parameters. For the water temperature, you need to keep them between 22 and 25 degrees Celsius or 71 to 78 degrees Fahrenheit, give or take a little bit. You need to keep your pH between 7.5 and 8 with a KH carbonate hardness of between 0 and 10. And a GH general hardness of between 4 and 16, and as usual ammonia, nitrite at 0 with nitrate somewhere below 20 parts per million. For the air temperature, 22 to 28 degrees Celsius or 71 to 82 degrees Fahrenheit is perfectly fine. And also, you need to take into account overnight lows and daily highs, which are going to be quite normal. So if your tank does go down to 20 degrees overnight and pop back up to about 30, that's okay, as long as this is gradual and over a 24-hour period. It's similar to what would happen in nature anyway. However, either way you look at it, if you live in a colder part of the world, you're going to need a heater to keep them within those temperature ranges. Moving on to the environment, you want to go as heavily planted as possible, so get as many plants into your space as you can, and you want to keep at least 80% of your tank as land and only 20% as water. You don't really need deep water either because the crabs can't swim, though they are really good climbers, so make sure they can climb out of the water nice and easily. If they can't get out of the water, they'll more than likely drown. So a water depth of anywhere between 2 inches and about 10 centimeters is perfectly fine. The most important thing is to make sure that the entire crab can sit in the water without any of its body being exposed. This is really important because they use the water to shed their skins or molt, and sandy substrates are best, or small gravel. For the land section, you want to maintain a moist soil with some dry patches if possible, as the crabs really like to burrow, so don't compact your soil too much so they can still have the option to dig in it. And also avoid anything really rocky because they won't be able to dig properly, and you don't want any cave-ins getting them trapped or crushing them. Once you've got the basics set up, they're really good at climbing and enjoy it. So if you can, try to build upward as well, using some sticks and other things so you can use the upper part of your tank a little bit more efficiently. They'll use just about all the space they can. And remember, although the crabs are generally social a lot of the time, they do like their own space and they will fight and bully each other, ripping each other to pieces sometimes. So you do need to make sure you have a complex tank so that crabs can escape if they're feeling like they might be in danger. This is especially important if you have a lot of females and you're going to be breeding them down the track. Tall plants work well for this and they'll climb the leaves and branches. And you'll also need to do the same in the water section. If you're not sure what plants to use for your tank, I'll leave a link in the description for some of the plant options you can use because there are quite a few and it does help to have a nice little list to start with. Chapter 3. What kind of water should you use for vampire crabs? Generally, you can use tap water for vampire crabs so long as you dechlorinate it first, and pretty much all typical aquarium dechlorination products work perfectly fine. Just be sure to follow the instructions on the bottle. The next most important thing here is not to use RO water, so reverse osmosis water or distilled water, unless you plan to remineralize it. Vampire crabs need a lot of minerals in their water to survive, so RO water on its own will eventually kill them. You can use bottled spring water or mineral water, but just be aware that sometimes this doesn't have a high enough mineral count, so it can cause some deficiencies. Chapter 4. Substrate and land for vampire crabs. First up, and most importantly, vampire crabs are terrestrial crabs that spend 99% of their time on the land. So you need to make sure that the tank is made up of at least 80% land, that's soil and dirt and not just dry land. Rocks and branches don't actually count in this percentage and will not be sufficient. So don't count these in your land space when you are planning and designing your tank. If you have a really big tank with a small population of crabs, you can be a little bit more liberal with this allocation, because 80% of the tank being land might end up being a hell of a lot of space if the tank is really big. Vampire crabs also require a substrate that is able to hold moisture and maintain a high level of humidity. And as I said earlier, I found the best option is just to use good old-fashioned dirt. Don't bother with any fancy mixes. Dirt is the most common thing they're going to find in their natural environment, and it allows them to burrow and promotes breeding a lot better than most of the other mixes. Also, something quite important is to avoid using any aqua soils or soils that are super acidic. Generally, also, aqua soils prevent any kind of burrowing because it just doesn't hold structure and collapses in on itself, and acidic soils, which are also quite likely to be aqua soils, can cause some issues for vampire crab shells. Again, you'll also need a lot of hiding places and plants for your setup, so don't forget to check out that link below for a full list. Chapter 5. Can you mix vampire crab species or colors? The simple answer to this question is no, and the complicated answer to this question is also no. Mixing Geosesarma species with any other species of crab, including other Geosesarma species, will eventually lead to warfare and death. It might not happen right away, but it's a ticking time bomb and will eventually happen. Each species will eventually start killing the other and you'll be left with one dominant species. There's a lot of idiots that do this and they say everything's perfectly fine, but sooner or later everything's going to fall apart and you'll never hear anything back from them. Not only will they kill each other, but in rare cases where they don't murder each other right away, they can actually hybridize, which will completely destroy the pure bloodlines and the species that we all currently have available. Unlike shrimp and other species, mixing does not generally result in any fantastic color variations. Most of the time they'll just come out as a muddy brown mess or have patches and bits and pieces of whatever color each had. It's essentially pretty much a waste of time. So don't bother taking the risk, just stick to keeping each species separate. But if you do want to breed certain traits, the best way is to line breed them within a single species. For example, if you want brighter yellow eyes, try and pick 2 crabs that have really good, strong genetics for yellow eyes. You can do the same for bigger claws, stronger purples, whatever. Just make sure you're doing the line breeding within each species. Chapter 6. The difference between different species. So currently there's between 40 and 50 different Geosesarma species, and a good portion of those have very similar requirements, so you might find a few little behavioral quirks here and there. Feeding and all the other parameters are also very similar, with the exception of the arboreal species that I mentioned earlier. These specific ones have a few little different traits that are very specific to them. For example, spending more time in the canopy, and molting exclusively on land. However, as I go through more species profiles, and I do find out that some of the species have even more differences, I will be writing some guides which you'll find over on my website, and eventually I'll make some videos on those species as well, so keep an eye out for them. Chapter 7, Vampire Crab Behavior. Vampire crabs are social creatures and should always be kept in groups, and it's recommended to have a ratio of 1 male to 2 females, and to keep no more than 3 crabs per 5 gallons, which is about 25 litres. Again, it's really important to provide plenty of different hiding spots and enough space for all of the crabs to coexist. However, if you do plan to keep a 5-gallon, 25-litre tank, you need to make sure you set it up really well or you're going to have a lot of fighting issues. I highly suggest getting something bigger, say a 10-gallon tank, which is about 50 litres to start with. While 5 gallons can work, I personally think they're better for people who've kept them before and know exactly what to keep an eye out for. While they are generally fairly peaceful, males can be quite territorial and will fight for females and other resources, and each crab does have a slightly different personality, as some will be more aggressive, some will be more social, and some will just be outright murderous. Chapter 7.1, Don't expect to see them often. Vampire crabs are mostly nocturnal and spend most of their time out at night, though during the day they'll generally come out for the first few hours in the morning and in the evening before the lights turn on or off. I found the best way to observe them is to have a light that has ramp up and ramp down options and adjustability, and you can set a nice intensity period at about 5 to 10%, which is just enough to simulate a morning or evening cycle. But the other important thing to take note here is that captive bred crabs will be a lot less shy and a lot less skittish, so you'll see them out a little bit more during the day. But if you watched the video I had mentioned earlier at the start, you already know all of this stuff. Chapter 8, Vampire Crab Diet and Food. Vampire crabs are omnivorous and will eat a variety of foods. In the wild, they primarily feed on small invertebrates, detritus, dead plant and animal matter. And in captivity, they can be fed a variety of foods including fruit, vegetables, commercial pellets, other commercial fish foods, and live foods as well. Some of the quick food suggestions I can add are boiled nettle, boiled spinach, boiled beans, peas, corn, zucchini, banana, fish, shrimp, snails, crickets, and isopods. There's a ton more, which you can find in other videos and also in my ebook. Some different species can be a little bit picky and fussy, so you might have to go through this list and find the specific things they actually do like, because it does vary a little bit sometimes. I think a lot of it comes down to crab personalities as well. Chapter 9, Vampire Crab Co-inhabitants, Land Animals. Springtails are a super important part of any vampire crab paludarium, and without them, your tank is going to fail. No questions asked. You need springtails to be successful. Isopods are also another beneficial thing to have for your crab enclosure, as they'll help to clean up any leftover food and crab waste. They eat very similar to springtails, but they do focus a little less on mold. Springtails are the mold specialists. If you are going to add isopods though, I highly suggest setting up a secondary colony, because your vampire crabs will eat them pretty fast, so you'll need to be able to have something to top up your main tank for. So having another colony of isopods to top up from is really handy. And again, remember, only keep one species of vampire crab together. Mixed colors and species is going to end up with a lot of death. Next, I also highly suggest keeping a species-only tank for vampire crabs, with the exception of your cleanup crew, consisting of isopods, springtails, and worms if you want to have worms. That's optional though. The main reason I say for this is it will reduce any potential stresses and give you the best possible outcome if you plan on breeding and raising babies. A lot of people like to keep them with morning geckos and frogs, but I personally wouldn't suggest this. Adult crabs won't generally be harmed, but the crabs can be quite aggressive and they will potentially attack any geckos or frogs. If you're planning to put dart frogs with your vampire crabs, I highly suggest against this as well, because dart frogs don't generally have a water section in their tank, whereas vampire crabs do, so there is a bit of conflict of interest here. Chapter 10, Vampire Crab Inhabitants, Fish. So this is where things get a little bit more tricky. A lot of people want to add fish to their vampire crab tanks, which is perfectly fine, but there are some important things you need to consider. The first thing is that you need to make sure the fish you select has the required minimum amount of space. If your chosen species needs 10 gallons of water, you need to make sure that's 10 gallons of water they can actually use. That's 10 gallons of swim space. Remember, 10 gallons is 50 liters. Next most important thing here is fish selection. This is super important because you need to make sure you select fast fish that can usually escape any attempts for the crabs to eat them. because the crabs will try to eat them. And my number one fish here to avoid is betta fish, especially the long species, because they're easy targets for the crabs to catch. And while they might not catch them the first time, they will slowly rip at the fish and eventually kill and eat them. The same thing goes for plecos. I get a lot of people sending me messages in my inbox of vampire crabs eating plecos. They're just really easy targets. Final thing with fish is that adding fish will also reduce your chances of baby vampire crabs by more than 90%. And this is because baby vampire crabs spend a lot of time on the water's edge, and the fish will pick them off pretty fast. Generally, the first 3 months of a baby vampire crab's life is spent on the water's edge or in the water. So if you have fish, that's 3 months of time the crabs will have the chance of being eaten. Chapter 11, Vampire Crab Co-inhabitants, Shrimp and Snails. So if fish are out of the question because you don't have enough space, you can always add shrimp, and shrimp are a really good addition for a vampire crab tank. They're generally super fast and can almost always avoid being eaten, though occasionally a crab will get lucky and eat a shrimp. But from my experience, the shrimp generally breed faster than they're being eaten, so they also do provide a good little food source if the crabs are quick enough. Also, just make sure you're only using Neocaridina shrimp and not Caridina shrimp, because Neos have pretty much the same water requirements as vampire crabs, so you can keep them without any sort of problems. Snails are also a really important part to have in vampire crab tanks, because the vampire crabs will eat them, and I highly suggest using something like ram's horn snails, because their shells are easy for the crabs to get into. They breed pretty fast. Most of the time you can get them for free from fish stores because they just want to give away the pests. And I personally think having snails in the water section is the equivalent of having springtails on the land. They're just really good at keeping things in order. Chapter 12, Breeding Vampire Crabs. Vampire crabs breed quite easily, and I currently have 9 species that I'm breeding, and they usually breed within the first 1 to 6 months of getting them. However, you do need to have your tank set up correctly, and I do know some people that have taken 12 to 18 months, so tank design is quite important for how fast they will breed. The breeding process can be quite rough though. The male, when mating with the female, will sometimes flip over on her back, and during this process he will rip some legs and claws off sometimes. And it is also possible that the female will return the favour to the male. Don't stress too much because this is quite normal, though if you do spot a crab in your tank with too many missing limbs, you'll definitely need to separate it for a while until it can molt and regrow its limbs, which will probably take a couple of months. Sometimes males are more aggressive than others, and I've heard quite a few cases of males killing females during the mating process in what essentially looks like a sport. This depends though and has a lot of luck because some crabs are a lot more aggressive than others. Generally, when the process is finished, the female will go into hiding and usually spend a few months in a little burrow deep underground somewhere. So you might not see her much during this time. But if you do know where her burrow is, sprinkle some food near the entrance, which will help prevent her wandering around and being attacked by another male. Females can produce between 20 and 80 offspring, though it's generally in the lower numbers. I would say somewhere around 30 or 40 is the most common, and when they give birth, they'll just drop live babies straight into the water section. It's also important to know that vampire crabs are highly cannibalistic, so you'll want to remove the babies or separate the parents as soon as possible. Otherwise, the parents will eat the babies pretty quickly. And the babies are extremely tiny at first, generally smaller than a small tick or an ant, so they can be quite hard to spot. They also grow super slowly, so there's a long time for them to become an easy snack. When they're first born, baby vampire crabs tend to hang around the water section a lot, usually for the first few months, as they'll be molting regularly and shedding their skin. Being close to the water section makes life easy for them. Also, if you're planning on having a nice big strong colony and you want social crabs, during this time when you spot your crabs near the water section, just sprinkle some food over them and they'll get used to seeing that you aren't a threat, and eventually you'll even be able to hand feed them. Initially, babies are quite social and get along well in groups, but at the same time they're also kind of cannibalistic, picking on any of the smaller ones in the group. But as they grow, they also start to become more territorial and eventually start bullying each other, so be prepared to separate them if things start to get a little bit rough. Babies are also super good climbers, even better than the adults, and you can see them climbing the silicone in the tank or the moisture on the glass. So this is where having a really strong lid is really important. Chapter 13, Vampire Crab Molting. So as we've mentioned a few times here, vampire crabs shed their skin or molt from time to time in a process called molting. They will do so in the water section, so it's important to make sure they have easy access to the water and a nice soft substrate to move around in. Once they shed their skin, they'll generally hide for about a week or so while they wait to harden up again. As soon as a vampire crab has shed its shell, it's basically just a piece of meat ready to be attacked or eaten by any other creature in the tank. During this time, their color will also change and become quite dull. It's also important not to remove the molts because they will consume these to get some calcium and minerals back, so just leave the empty molts in the tank. The molting phase also allows crabs to regenerate lost limbs, so they can grow back their legs, claws, but unfortunately they don't seem to be able to grow back eyes. So if they lose an eye during a fight, it's gone forever. At least what I've observed so far. There are also a couple of exceptions with Geosesarma species. Geosesarma nodophorum and Geosesarma pontianak both molt on land, so they don't need a water section to molt, and you'll find them molting up in the trees, wherever they can find a nice stable spot in the tank. I'm not sure how common this is amongst some of the other species that aren't quite fully described yet, so there might be others that do this as well, but we don't quite know yet. Chapter 14, Vampire Crab Lifespans. So the average lifespan of a vampire crab is between 2 and 2.5 years, though I have heard them living between 3 and 4 years as well, but that is quite rare. In my personal experience keeping them for quite a few years with 10 different species, I would say they pretty much max out at about 2.5 years. Unfortunately, I have so many different ones now, it is a little bit tricky to keep track of their age, but on average, prior to having so many, 2.5 years was pretty much dead on the mark. Chapter 15, Handling Vampire Crabs. So there are a few videos saying that handling vampire crabs is fine, but I honestly disagree with that 100%. And the reason for that is because they're super fragile and super prone to bursts of speed, which means they can jump at any given time. And if they land on a hard surface, even if it's only a fall of a few inches or 15 centimeters, they will die. They won't die straight away, but they'll be damaged enough inside they might die within the next couple of hours or the next couple of days. So I would avoid handling them as much as possible, and generally only handle them if you need to move them between tanks. Chapter 16, Where to buy vampire crabs, and online shipping. So this is where things get really complicated, and purchasing Geosesarma species is quite difficult, especially if you're going to be using online sellers. I've got an entire video dedicated to this subject, but I'm just going to go over a few things quickly here. Number 1, you need to avoid international sellers because the crabs are going to arrive dead 99.9% of the time, or you're going to get a nice big fine in the mail for importing something illegally. Then there's the fact that a large portion of them are just going to scam you. Depending on where you live in the world, there are some shops you can get them from which do have shipping, and they do try pretty well to make sure the crabs arrive alive, but I personally wouldn't order anything when the temperature outside is too cold or too hot. So make sure you're timing things and paying for the best, fastest shipping possible. The quicker you get them, the better. If you have the option though, the best place is to get them locally, so maybe look around on some Facebook groups or any similar kind of groups, or see if your local fish store can get them in. But as I said earlier, for a really deep dive on this topic, check out the video I have linked in the description, because there's quite a few interesting things you might not be expecting. Chapter 17, Vampire Crab Personalities. So just like with most other animal species, vampire crabs have weird little quirky personalities, and some are braver than others, while some are more relaxed and calm. You'll also occasionally get an absolute rage machine that just wants to murder and kill everything, but from my experience, these are quite rare. If you do get a maniac like this though, just catch him out and isolate him in his own little tank, and don't feel bad keeping one raging male by himself. He's earned his punishment, so he's going to have to live out his life in solitude. Chapter 18, Which species of Geosesarma should I get? If you're just starting out with vampire crabs, there are a couple of important things you need to consider. And the first is that you want to get species that are quite tough and readily available. So I would opt for a Geosesarma Hagen, Geosesarma Danila, or Geosesarma Halloween if they are available to you. These are the most common species, and they're also quite tough compared to some of the others, so they would be my top 3 picks if you're a beginner. The other reason for suggesting these species is because they are kind of easy to get, so if you do need to get more at a later date, you should be able to find them easily. If you get a more rare species, you might never see them again, and then you'll have trouble getting extra crabs or finding more females down the track. Picking rare species also generally means having a tougher time keeping them alive, especially with some of the more delicate species like Geosesarma nodophorum and Geosesarma pontianak. Just remember, if you do want a new species, you do need to set up another tank, so just keep one species per tank and you won't have any problems. So chapter 19 and the final chapter, building a paludarium for vampire crabs. If you have watched everything so far and you're ready to make a new tank, check out this video here because it is my top 12 vampire crab ecosystem builds from last year. And there is a tank size and tank style for pretty much everyone. There's low-tech tanks, high-tech tanks, small tanks and big tanks. And they're also really handy for people on a budget. And if you do have any questions about any of those builds, I've got no problem answering any of those questions. So just drop a comment on that video or any of the other videos I have, and I'll be happy to help. You can also find me over on Facebook and Instagram if you want to drop me a message or send me some pictures of your current tank. Anyway, that wraps it up for this video. Thanks for watching, good luck, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers everyone.